There's one belief shared by many Asian families. Send your child abroad and they'll be safe, with a chance to become a better version of themselves. The three Chinese families in today's story once believed the same thing. They sent their children to Toronto, Canada, hoping they'd study in a better environment and begin a future filled with possibilities. What they didn't account for was that these kids were only 17 or 18 years old, living thousands of miles away from their families for the first time, and suddenly having to make decisions on their own. Decisions that, until then, had always been made with adults nearby to guide and supervise them. In that void, three young people met, fell in love, and became entangled in jealousy. In early February 2017, a tragedy unfolded, destroying the futures of everyone involved and taking with it all the hopes and expectations those three families had sent across the ocean. So what happened inside that house? And how did a love triangle between people who were only 18 or 19 years old end with someone dead? Let's go back to the beginning of 2015. The case takes us to North York, in the northern part of Toronto. If Toronto is often described as one of the world's most livable cities, then North York comes very close to embodying that image. Rows of low-rise homes, maple trees lining both sides of the streets, subway trains running through residential neighborhoods, low crime rates, and a well-regarded school system. At its heart lies Willowdale, one of the largest concentrations of people of Asian descent in North America, where signs in Chinese are almost as common as those in English. That's exactly why so many middle-class Chinese families chose this area when sending their children abroad to study. But beneath that reality was another layer. Toronto had developed an entire ecosystem of private international schools catering to this influx of foreign students. Some operated legitimately and responsibly. Others had student bodies made up almost entirely of Chinese students, with lax attendance policies. Some students showed up only once or twice a week, just enough to avoid having their visas revoked. As for housing, many lived in townhouses divided among 5 or 6 people, with converted basements serving as the cheapest rooms in the house. In other words, these 17 and 18-year-olds had almost complete freedom and a steady flow of money from their parents. But no adults beside them, and not enough life experience to balance the two. For those who were grounded and mature, it was a chance to grow up very quickly. For those who hadn't yet had the chance to mature, it was a gray area. And everything you're about to hear happened inside that gray area. In January 2015, Wang Haozhi arrived in Toronto. He was born in 1997 and came from Zhengzhou, Henan Province. His family worked in foreign trade. They weren't extraordinarily wealthy, but after years of hard work and saving, they were considered well off by local standards. There were 2 children in the family, Wang Haozhi and his twin brother, Wang Haoqiang. The problem was that the family could only afford to send one of their 2 sons abroad to study, and the one they chose was Wang Haozhi. His twin brother stayed behind in China. Wang Haozhi stood about 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed around 198 pounds. He was good-looking, easygoing, and adapted quickly to his new surroundings. Not long after arriving, he'd already found his place among the friends around him. He wasn't the kind of wealthy kid who liked to show off either. He knew how hard his parents worked for their money, so he didn't compete with others or try to keep up appearances. Instead, he chose to rent a place with classmates to save money. Every week he called his parents back home, telling them about school, his friends, and just how brutally cold the weather in Toronto could get. To be fair, Wang Haozhi wasn't a model student. He was enrolled in an English language program at a school for international students, but his progress was slow, and he had to repeat the course. Even so, in 2015, his life was still, for the most part, the ordinary life of an 18-year-old living abroad for the first time. Everything was new. He was free. And the future seemed full of hope. Until one gathering at a karaoke bar. Around August 2015, during a get-together among international students at a karaoke bar in Toronto, Wang Haozhi met a girl. Her name was Tanjiaki, though her friends called her by her English name, Kiki. Tanjiaki was born in 1997 and came from Shantou, Guangdong Province. She arrived in Canada at roughly the same time as Wang Haozhi. She attended another private high school in the city called MacDonald International Academy. At 19 years old, she was still taking grade 11 English, and in any given week she attended class no more than 2 days. Less than a month after that night at the karaoke bar, the two were a couple, and Wang Haozhi loved this girl with almost no limits. He took her to expensive restaurants. He bought her designer handbags, jewelry, diamond rings, and necklaces. He frequently skipped school to go to her school, just so he could sit there and wait for her classes to end. Then he did something that would leave almost anyone stunned. He handed her all 3 of his bank cards and allowed her to change the passwords herself. From that moment on, all the money Wang Haozhi's parents sent from Zhengzhou to Toronto was, in reality, no longer under his control. In less than 2 years, Wang Haozhi spent nearly 100,000 Canadian dollars on his girlfriend. In 2016 alone, his family transferred more than 70,000 Canadian dollars to him. For a family working in foreign trade in Zhengzhou, that wasn't the kind of money that could disappear unnoticed, and they did notice. Wang Haozhi's parents began reviewing his expenses. They asked their son what he'd been using all that money for. Wang Haozhi told them he needed to buy study materials and that his rent had gone up. He listed each expense in detail and wrote a pledge to his parents, trying to prove that he wasn't spending money recklessly. Even so, it didn't stop his family from tightening the reins and cutting back his living allowance. Because when less money started coming from home, Wang Haozhi didn't choose to spend less on his girlfriend. He chose to spend less on himself. He moved out of the apartment he'd been renting for more than $3,000 a month and moved in with other people, taking a room in the basement. He cut his food expenses down to the bare minimum. There were stretches when he survived on instant noodles. At times, he even had to borrow money from friends just to cover food and rent. The young man, who stood about 6 feet 4 inches tall, dropped from roughly 198 pounds to around 141. From a distance, he looked almost like a long, thin stick. But everything he sacrificed still wasn't enough. Because no matter how quickly Wang Haozhi tried to save money, he could never keep pace with how quickly it was being spent on the other side. One of Tan Jiaqi's classmates said that Tan had told them Wang Haozhi was too childish and that she was planning to break up with him. He was still saving every dollar, planning for the upcoming Valentine's Day, and wondering what gift he should buy for his girlfriend. Then, around January 2017, at another gathering of international students, a third person entered this story, Fan Boqiao. He was also born in 1997, the same age as Wang Haozhi and Tan Jiaqi, and came from Guangdong province. He'd arrived in Canada around 2011, 4 years earlier than the other two, and completed high school at a private school in Toronto, where Chinese students made up more than 90% of the student body. He was an only child. His mother worked in foreign trade. His father worked in banking in Guangdong, and the family could be described as very well off. Fan Boqiao himself was tall, good-looking, and had trained in Muay Thai for 7 or 8 years. Speaking about his training, he once said, "You learn to fight so you can take down the person you want to take down and protect the person you want to protect." At the beginning of 2017, he was renting an apartment in North York on Grandview Way. And there was a coincidence that no one paid attention to at the time. His apartment was only about a 5-minute drive from the place Wang Haozhi was renting. Also, around January 2017, Tan Jiaqi and Fan Boqiao began a romantic relationship, but she said nothing to Wang Haozhi. In other words, there had been no breakup at all. For about a month, she maintained both relationships at the same time. Wang Haozhi, meanwhile, could sense that she was pulling away. He called her. He texted her, and he was no longer getting the kind of response he once had, but he still didn't know what was happening. He only found out around February 6th, 2017. That day, after learning that he'd been replaced and that he'd been kept in the dark for an entire month, Wang Haozhi posted a message on his social media page. He wrote, "Now I understand. I was still thinking about what gift I should give you for February 14th. This is the best gift you could have given me. I wish you happiness." As you can easily see, there was no threat written in that post, and no one was named. But Tan Jiaqi read the message and interpreted it differently. She believed Wang Haozhi was making insinuations about her and bad-mouthing her in front of the wider international student community. She told her new boyfriend that Wang Haozhi had humiliated her, and she said he'd called her a word used to describe a prostitute. Then she called Wang Haozhi and demanded that he meet both her and her new boyfriend so they could settle the matter face to face. Wang Haozhi replied that he didn't want to talk. He said he only wanted to have one fight with the other man. I think that was the response of a 19-year-old who'd just been deeply hurt and no longer knew how else to deal with his emotions. But he could never have imagined that the words, "I wish you happiness," together with that impulsive remark, would become the two things that led him to his death. Sometime after 10 p.m. on February 6th, Tan Jiaqi and Fan Boqiao got into a car. They drove to 13 Hounslow Avenue in North York. It was a multi-story townhouse where Wang Haozhi was renting a room with several other Chinese international students. Fan Boqiao parked outside, near a bank branch at the end of the street. Then the two of them went inside. It was the first time in their lives that the two young men had ever seen each other face to face. Before that night, they had never known one another. Fan Boqiao said his purpose in going there was to make Wang Haozhi keep quiet and stop damaging his girlfriend's reputation within the international student community. But inside that living room, neither side managed to stay calm for more than a few sentences. The conversation immediately turned into an argument. Then the argument turned into insults. Fan Boqiao said that, in the heat of the moment, Wang Haozhi made a remark implying that the woman Fan was now with was something Wang had already used and discarded for Fan to pick up afterward. And that was the final remark before everything fell apart. Fan Boqiao lunged forward and struck Wang Haozhi repeatedly in the head and neck. Wang's nose immediately began to bleed, and one side of his face started to swell. He got back up and landed a punch on Fan's face. But by that point, the difference between them was simply too great. Wang had lost nearly 66 pounds from his previous weight. Fan Boqiao had years of Muay Thai training behind him. Fan Boqiao still wanted to keep going. He couldn't stop himself. The people who stopped him were the others living in the house. Hearing the noise from the living room, one of Wang Haozhi's housemates, a man named Eric, came running out. He rushed between the two men and pushed Fan Boqiao away. Fan turned toward him. At that moment, another housemate came up from the basement, saw that the situation was getting out of control, and came up behind Fan, holding him tightly to keep him back. As he was being restrained, Fan Boqiao pointed at the people stopping him and said, "Do you know who I am?" Then he looked down at Wang Haozhi, who had already fallen to the floor, and added one more warning. If Wang dared to get involved with Kiki again, Fan said, he would show him who he was. Tan Jiaqi stood nearby throughout the confrontation. She told her boyfriend to stop hitting him. Then the two of them left the house. Had the story ended there, it would have been nothing more than a violent clash between international students. But it didn't end there. After the two of them left, a silence settled over 13 Hounslow Avenue. Wang Haozhi didn't go back to his room. He lay half-reclined on the living room sofa, pressing a cold towel against his nose to stop the bleeding. He told one of his housemates that he felt terrible. He said his neck hurt. The housemate stood there for a while. In front of him was someone who'd just been dumped by his girlfriend, then beaten by her new boyfriend inside his own home, right in front of her. He didn't know what to say. So he offered Wang a few words of comfort, then went back to his room to rest. The living room lights were still on. Wang Haozhi remained on the sofa, one hand holding the towel in place. He took out his phone and called a friend. He told him what had happened that night. The friend on the other end listened as Wang described everything. I want to pause here for a moment, because this is where the entire story changes direction, because outside the house on the way back, something else was happening. Fan Boqiao later said that as they drove away, Tan Jiaqi became more and more upset as she thought about how humiliated she felt. She cried. She said she couldn't accept what had happened. She said that unless Wang Haozhi was taught a real lesson, he would keep bothering her in the future. Fan said that seeing his girlfriend cry made him so angry he could barely contain himself. The two punches he'd landed earlier had been far too light, he said. They had to go back and finish it properly before the matter could truly be over. Back inside the house, one of the housemates saw his phone light up. About 10 minutes after leaving, Tan Jiaqi sent him a message saying she was furious and wanted to hit Wang Haozhi. The housemate told her to go home. A little later, she messaged again. This time, she said she'd forgotten her car keys and a cigar keeper and asked him to open the door. At first, he refused. He looked for the items several times but couldn't find them. She kept messaging him, saying again and again and again that she urgently needed both things, that she'd only come upstairs to get them and leave right away, and that she promised she wouldn't cause any trouble. In the end, the housemate agreed. He told her to park in the backyard, then went downstairs to open the rear basement door. And the moment that door opened, Fan Boqiao slipped inside. He didn't rush upstairs immediately. He apologized to the housemate several times, saying he didn't want to fight inside someone else's home and leave the place in a mess. He said that because of Tan Jiaqi, he had no other choice. At the time, the housemate didn't understand what those words meant. He simply told Fan to go upstairs, get the things quickly, and come back down. Fan Boqiao went upstairs. Tan Jiaqi was stopped by the housemate and remained in the basement laundry area. Upstairs, Wang Haozhi was still on the phone with his friend, and suddenly, the friend on the other end heard Wang shout, just one sentence, in a voice filled with shock. "How did you get into my house?" After that came a burst of chaotic sounds. The friend heard dull, heavy thuds, the kind of sound made by fists striking a body. He heard what seemed to be the phone hitting the floor and then being knocked somewhere else, perhaps under the sofa, because everything afterward sounded more distant and muffled. Beneath the pounding sounds, he heard a man shouting a sentence that included the words, "beat to death." Finally, he heard a woman's voice. Stop hitting him, let's go." Then the call ended. Inside the house, Eric had been resting in his room when he heard a loud commotion coming from the living room. He ran out. What he saw was Fan Boqiao, now without his jacket, wearing only a tank top, sitting on top of Wang Haozhi on the sofa. His knee was planted firmly against Wang's chest, pinning him down so he couldn't move, and Fan was driving his fists into Wang's face, one blow after another. Eric rushed forward to intervene. Fan Boqiao raised a blood-covered fist and asked whether Eric wanted to get beaten too. Eric stopped. All he could do was stand there and watch as Fan Boqiao landed another 4 or 5 blows to Wang Haozhi's head before finally stopping. By the time Fan Boqiao stopped, Wang Haozhi's face and head were covered in blood. There was blood on the sofa, blood on the floor. Wang was no longer moving. He was no longer responding. Eric pulled out his phone to call emergency services, and the hand that stopped him did not belong to Fan Boqiao. Tan Jiaqi had come upstairs. She grabbed Eric's hand. She told him that 911 wasn't only the emergency number, it was also the number that would bring the police. If he called, she said, the police would come and the situation would become a very serious matter. Fan Boqiao was still acting extremely aggressive in the living room, and because of that, Eric put his phone down. Instead, he called for a ride through an app. Together with another friend, they carried Wang Haozhi outside, placed him in the vehicle, and rushed him to North York General Hospital. Fan Boqiao and Tan Jiaqi arrived at the hospital later as well. But there was one thing neither of them had anticipated. When they stepped into the hospital hallway that night, the police were already there. Wang Haozhi never regained consciousness. He died within the next 36 hours, before his parents and his twin brother could even arrive in Canada. By this point, you know everything that happened inside that house that night. But the most unbelievable part of this case hadn't even begun. When Wang Haozhi's body was taken for examination, the findings showed that the direct cause of death was a blow to the temple. That strike ruptured blood vessels in his head, causing massive bleeding inside the skull. In addition, a major artery in his neck had been damaged, and there were multiple fractures to the bones of his head and face. The case record stated that Fan Boqiao struck Wang Haozhi in the head and neck, pinned him beneath his body, grabbed him by the hair, and pressed his knee into Wang's chest. But in the entire autopsy report, there was one detail that, to me, may be the most telling detail in the whole case. It was so small that most accounts of the case barely mention it. The forensic pathologist collected samples from beneath Wang Haozhi's fingernails. And in the material recovered from beneath the fingernails of his right hand, investigators found Fan Boqiao's DNA. On February 8, 2017, Fan Boqiao was formally charged with second-degree murder under Canadian law. In Canada, that offense carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment with a parole ineligibility period of between 10 and 25 years. It was also Toronto's 9th homicide of 2017. By then, Fan Boqiao's parents had flown from China to Canada as soon as they heard the news. The first thing they did was not go to see their son. The first thing they did was find a lawyer. The man they turned to was Brian Greenspan. In Canada, Brian Greenspan is one of the most prominent names in criminal defense. He's the kind of lawyer business executives, celebrities, and wealthy families call when they find themselves in serious legal trouble. The next step was to seek bail. The court set bail at 3.75 million Canadian dollars. Fan Boqiao's family was able to meet that amount, including $1 million in cash. After spending about 3 months in custody, Fan Boqiao was released. He moved into a detached house in the city of Markham worth more than $2 million. His parents had purchased the property about a year before the case occurred. The conditions of his release were strict. He had to live with 2 sureties who were Canadian citizens. He had to wear an electronic ankle monitor 24 hours a day. He could leave the house only for specific reasons, such as attending school, receiving medical care, meeting with his lawyer, or appearing in court. He wasn't allowed to leave the province of Ontario, and he was prohibited from contacting anyone connected to the case. And during the 30 months he lived under those conditions, he continued his education. Meanwhile, on the other side of the case, everything was moving in the opposite direction. Wang Haozhi's parents gradually sold off their assets back home. Over the next 2 years, they traveled back and forth between China and Canada repeatedly to follow every court hearing. Wang Haozhi's twin brother, Wang Haoqiang, had to temporarily suspend his studies to deal with his brother's case, and at one point publicly appealed for attention on social media because it was the only tool his family had. The case went to trial in Ontario in October 2019. 2 years and 8 months after that night. The entire trial revolved around a single question. When Fan Boqiao went upstairs and delivered those blows, what did he intend to do? If the jury believed that he intended to cause serious bodily harm and knew that his actions could result in death, then it was second-degree murder. If the jury believed that he only intended to assault Wang and that the death was an unintended consequence, then it was manslaughter. And in Canada, manslaughter carries no mandatory minimum sentence unless a firearm is involved. Fan Boqiao's entire fate rested between those 2 possibilities, and the battle centered on 3 points. The first was the route through the basement. You remember the sequence of text messages from that night. Both sides looked at the exact same messages and saw 2 completely different stories. The prosecution saw intent. They argued that the order of the messages spoke for itself. The desire to attack came first. The excuse for returning came afterward. The people inside the house also testified to something no one had paid much attention to that night. Tanjaki herself had suggested entering through the basement because she'd lived there before and knew that the small rear door was normally left unlocked. The defense saw a different story. Fan Boqiao said the 2 of them had originally intended to go home, but then discovered that the car keys and cigar keeper had been left behind. He said he was reluctant to face Wang Haozhi again and had hesitated. According to him, the idea of using the basement entrance was simply a way to quietly go upstairs, retrieve the items, and leave without having to face anyone. The second point was the jacket. The prosecution argued that when Fan Boqiao went upstairs the second time, he took off his outer jacket before throwing the first punch, and that he'd said he would beat Wang Haozhi to death. Taken together, those 2 details suggested that this wasn't a spontaneous reaction, but an act for which he had mentally prepared himself. People take off their jackets when they know what they're about to do. Fan Boqiao denied ever making that statement. As for the jacket, he offered a very simple explanation. He said the house was too warm, so he took it off. The defense added another argument. The housemate hadn't witnessed the entire second confrontation from beginning to end. He only came running out after the violence was already underway. That meant no one had seen the beginning, the part that determined who struck first. And according to Fan Boqiao, this is what happened. When he reached the living room, Wang Haozhi was shocked, demanded to know how he'd gotten into the house, then grabbed Fan by the hair and pushed him down onto the sofa. Fan said he fought back to free himself. He said the entire incident lasted only about 5 seconds, that he threw only 3 or 4 punches, and that he had absolutely no intention of killing anyone. The third point, and to me, this is the strangest point in the entire case, was a single statement. Do you remember the friend who was on the phone with Wang Haozhi when Fan Boqiao came upstairs? That friend testified in court, and he described the sequence of sounds he'd heard, including the voice of a man shouting a phrase that contained the words, "beat to death." The problem was this: the same sequence of sounds could be heard in 2 completely different ways. The first interpretation was, "Fight, fight, I'll beat you to death." If those were Fan Boqiao's words, then they amounted to a declaration of intent to kill, and the case immediately tilted towards second-degree murder. The second interpretation was, "Fight, fight, I'll let you beat me to death." If those were Wang Haozhi's words, then the entire picture changed. It became the challenge of someone in a state of desperation, and the defense could argue that the victim himself had provoked the confrontation. When spoken in Chinese, the 2 sentences have very similar sound patterns, but their meanings sit at opposite ends of the same case. When this friend spoke to police immediately after the incident, he said he'd heard it one way. When he testified in court, he gave the other version. And under questioning by the defense, he ultimately admitted that because everything had happened so suddenly, he could no longer remember exactly which sentence he'd heard, nor could he say with certainty who had spoken it. What was certain was this: no one sitting through the case understood Chinese, and the only witness who had heard the sounds from that decisive moment was no longer certain about what he'd heard. On October 30th, 2019, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Fan Boqiao was found not guilty of second-degree murder, but guilty of manslaughter. When the verdict was read, Wang Haozhi's family reacted strongly in the courtroom. Fan Boqiao's parents, meanwhile, left the courtroom with his defense attorney. 1 week later came the sentencing hearing. In court, Fan Boqiao apologized to the family and friends of the man who had died. He said he deeply regretted ever entering that house. He said Wang Haozhi's death filled him with sorrow, that he didn't know what he could possibly do to make amends, and that this case would follow him for the rest of his life. The prosecution asked for an 8-year sentence. The defense asked for 3 years. On November 6, 2019, the presiding judge handed down the final sentence: 5 years in prison. And in practice, the number was even lower than that. Under the rules for crediting time already served, the time Fan Boqiao had spent in pretrial detention was deducted from his sentence. He also received 2 months of credit for the 30 months he'd spent under house arrest at the home in Markham. After all the deductions, the time he still had left to serve was 4 years and 5 months. The judge also said something during the hearing that day. He noted that Fan Boqiao was in his 3rd year of university and hoped to continue his studies in Canada, but that plan was no longer possible, because once he was released on parole, he'd be deported to China, and that is exactly what happened. He served his sentence, then Canadian immigration authorities deported him back to China with a criminal record. After that, his life seemed to disappear from public view. As for the girl at the center of this story, Tan Jiaqi was never charged. After investigating, Toronto police concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to lay charges against her, and that they wouldn't continue investigating her actions. Her passport was returned to her. The investigator in charge of the case told reporters that after the incident, Tan Jiaqi returned to mainland China. After Fan Boqiao was arrested, she dropped out of school. She deleted her entire friends list on the messaging app, and her classmates lost contact with her. Reporters called her phone number twice. No one answered. Then the number was no longer in service. That meant 12 jurors examined this entire case without ever once hearing a single word from the person standing at the center of the story. Legally, that was the end of the case. But the story still had one more chapter. And it would take 7 years for that chapter to be written. On January 16th, 2024, in China, an announcement was issued by the Central Disciplinary Inspection Authority. It stated that a banking official was under investigation on suspicion of serious violations of discipline and law. That person was Fan Boqiao's father. 6 months later, on July 19th, 2024, the findings were announced. Fan was expelled from the party and removed from all public positions. All assets obtained through violations were confiscated, and the case file concerning the suspected criminal offenses was transferred to prosecutors for review and possible prosecution in accordance with the law, together with all related assets. The announcement detailed what he'd done. Over a long period, he'd accepted gifts and money from people who could influence the performance of his official duties. He allowed others to pay expenses that he should have paid himself. He violated regulations governing profit-making business activities. And most importantly, he abused his position to obtain benefits for others in the processes of lending and granting credit to businesses while illegally accepting enormous amounts of assets in return. As for the victim's family, Wang Haozhi was brought back to his hometown of Zhengzhou and buried there. Today's case ends here, but perhaps there are still a few things we should take away from it. It's not a lesson about loving the wrong person, because that's not something anyone can simply choose. Nor is it a lesson about money, because that part is already painfully obvious. What I keep thinking about most is the silence between the 2 times Fan Boqiao entered that house. During that silence, everything could still have been saved. But someone chose to go back. Someone chose to open the basement door, and someone chose to stop the hand that was about to call for emergency help. None of them, at 19 years old, understood that the small decisions they made within the span of a single hour would close off the entire future of all 3 of them. What do you think about the sentence in this case, and about the role each person played in what happened? Let's discuss it in the comments below. That's where today's video ends, and I'll see you again in the next one.